We've also negotiated an option for 3 million more Pfizer doses to be delivered in September. We'll keep getting shipments secured until everyone can get their shots. But at the pace we're going, that target is well within reach. 65% of eligible Canadians have now received at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. That makes Canada the G20 country with the highest percentage of the population with a first shot. That is really encouraging. Because the more people are vaccinated, the safer we all are, and the closer we all get to being through this crisis. In other words, you have reason to be hopeful about this summer and this fall. So let's start looking forward to more of what we love, from camping to dinner with friends. Canada
will be receiving over 2 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine each week until the end of August. These vaccines will help lead us to a better future. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to discuss with some volunteers from This Is Our Shot, a group that brings together stakeholders from commerce and industry, as well as people from unions and all kinds of backgrounds. And their goal is to encourage vaccination across the country. They're doing excellent work, and we're here to support that type of initiative. We're all working with the same goal. And speaking of working together, today I also want to talk about another very important subject, reconciliation.
This has been a painful week for so many Indigenous people and communities across the country. On Wednesday, Minister Bennett announced funding that is ready to be deployed immediately to support survivors, families, and communities harmed by the terrible wrongs of the residential school system. $27 million is now available to Indigenous communities to find and honor children who died at these institutions. This is something that communities have asked for, and we've long been here to support that. Of course, we also know that residential schools were only one piece of a larger colonial system, and the work to right these wrongs, both past and present, is far from over.
Yesterday, the National Action Plan was presented in response to the final report on the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. As part of this plan, we also launched our contribution, the Federal Pathway, which lays out what our government will do to follow up on the final report's calls to action. We are accelerating our work and our investments to improve the lives of Indigenous people, always in partnership with them.
When we took office in 2015, this was the reality. Indigenous kids were receiving on average only 2/3 of their share of funding for education as compared to non-Indigenous students. There was underinvestment in schools on reserve across the country. 0 Jordan's principal requests were granted, and in 10 years under Stephen Harper, there was no serious work done on lifting long-term drinking water advisories. In the years since, we have made progress.
Since 2015, around 33,000 children now have new schools or better schools. We supported over 828,000 requests under Jordan's principle so that children can remain healthy. We also improved fairness when it comes to primary and secondary school funding for Indigenous students, while ensuring that young people have access to education in their language that is culturally appropriate and takes into account local priorities. And all across the country, we have made progress in rectifying the shortcomings that have existed for too long by lifting over 100 boil water advisories. And those are just a few examples of what we've done.
Just this week, in Parliament, we officially created the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. We've moved forward so that our citizenship oath now includes recognition of Indigenous peoples. And the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has made it through the House, and I call on the Senate to ensure that it passes very soon. Overall, 80% of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action that fall under our government's responsibility are completed or well underway. This is progress, but there is much more to do. That's why we're giving more control to Indigenous communities over healthcare, as well as making sure there are fewer Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system. Indigenous peoples across the country should feel safe and respected and should have a real and fair chance at success. Together, this is the future we must all build. Finally, I want to talk about this morning's news that the economy lost 68,000 jobs in May, particularly part-time jobs, because of the third wave. If you lost your job, we're here for you. The wage subsidy, the stronger and more flexible EI, the Canada Recovery Benefit, those were designed for you. We have your back as long as this crisis lasts.
We are determined to beat this pandemic and to ensure that we can all emerge stronger. Thank you, and I'll now be giving the floor to Minister Anand.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Hello, everyone. With the updated Pfizer schedule that the Prime Minister just announced, we now have the complete schedule from Pfizer for all of our committed doses, including the additional 3 million options announced that we would be purchasing today. That is a total of 51 million doses that will have been delivered from Pfizer before the end of September. I would like to sincerely thank Pfizer for the partnership. We have a complete delivery schedule from Pfizer. Pfizer's deliveries arrive on time and are stable. Thank you so much.
As I've said frequently during these updates, the second quarter of this year would be marked by ever-increasing deliveries. And that is exactly what we have seen.
Right now, we have had 29 million doses delivered to Canada, 25 million of which have been administered by the provinces and territories. And more than 2/3 of eligible Canadians have had at least one dose.
But the work is not done yet.
I continue to work with Moderna as well as the U.S. government to stabilize its delivery schedule to Canada. Once that schedule is confirmed, I will, of course, share the details. In the meantime, we know that Moderna will be delivering millions more doses this month and in the weeks ahead. At least 1.5 million doses will be coming during the week of June 14th, for example. And let us not forget that Pfizer is going to continue to deliver more than 2 million doses per week until at least the end of August.
By early next week, Canada will have received more than 30 million doses of vaccines. Millions of Canadians have already received their first dose. And I strongly encourage any eligible person who has yet to receive a first dose to do so.
In fact, all of my family members, including my 4 children, have now had their first shot. One final note. The other day, I had the privilege to meet with representatives from This Is Our Shot, a group of dedicated volunteers working hard every day to encourage as many people as possible to get vaccinated. I want to thank them and congratulate them on the amazing work that they are doing. In closing, Canada is now first in the G20 and the G7 for the percentage of our population with at least one dose. The vaccines are here with millions more on the way. That is my sole focus. That is our government's focus to bring vaccines to Canada for Canadians. Thank you. Merci, Miigwech.
Dr. Tim?
Bonjour à tous et à tous.
Good morning, everyone.
Nationally, COVID-19 disease activity and severity trends continue to decline. The latest 7-day average for daily cases is just over 2,300, which is 73% lower than the peak of the third wave. The latest 7-day average for the number of people with COVID-19 being treated in our hospitals each day has dropped 47% since the peak to just over 2,300 daily. Of these, on average, 1,000 were being treated in intensive care units, down 31% since the peak, and average daily deaths are down 35% to 34 deaths being reported daily. As of today, over 25 million doses have been administered across Canada, with close to 2.8 million Canadians getting a dose of COVID-19 vaccine in the past week alone. As of May the 29th, 65% of the population aged 12 years or older have received at least one dose. As of May the 30th, there have been 44 national reports of rare but serious blood clots with low levels of blood platelets following immunization with the AstraZeneca vaccines in Canada. Of those, 30 have tested positive for the PF4 antibodies, meeting the definition of vaccine-induced immune thrombocytopenia, or VIT. Laboratory testing on the remaining 14 individuals is ongoing. Sadly, among those confirmed cases of it, there have been 5 deaths reported. We offer our most sincere condolences to the loved ones of those who have passed away. Every week, we get closer to 75% of eligible Canadians having received their first dose of vaccine protection against COVID-19. As we pass that goal in the coming weeks, provinces and territories are also accelerating their second dose programs to get more people in Canada fully vaccinated for optimal protection against COVID-19. If you don't have your first shot or haven't booked an appointment yet, now is the time. This includes those who are pregnant or breastfeeding, as well as those with an autoimmune condition or who are immunosuppressed. If you've already had your first shot, thank you. It's win-win. You're now better protected, and you've taken an important step to bring us closer to end the crisis phase of the pandemic in Canada. You can now keep an eye out for when you'll be eligible to receive your second shot. Even if you already have an appointment, be sure to monitor local public health information, as appointment dates may be moved up as supply increases. Getting that second dose is important, both for your own protection and for building immunity in your community. This is a double win-win. While your first dose provides priming immunity, providing most of us with good protection and reducing the likelihood of severe illness, the second dose is crucial for boosting our immune systems to build strong and longer-lasting immunity. We're on the right path to get back to the things that we miss. Let's keep going steady as we go and not let complacency hold us back from a safer summer sooner. Thank you. Merci, Megwidge.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Good morning, everyone. Nationally, COVID-19 disease activity and severity trends continue to decline. The latest 7-day average for daily cases was just over 2,300, which is 73% lower than the peak of the third wave. The latest 7-day average for the number of people with COVID-19 being treated in our hospitals every day has dropped 47% since the peak to just over 2,300 daily. Of these, on average, 1,000 people were being treated in intensive care units, down 31% since the peak. And average daily deaths are down 35% to 34 deaths being reported daily. As of today, almost 25 million doses have been administered across Canada, with close to 2.8 million Canadians getting a dose of COVID-19 vaccine in the past week alone. As of the end of May, 65% of the population aged 12 and older have received at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. As of May 30th, there have been 44 national reports of rare but serious blood clots, with low levels of blood platelets following immunization with the AstraZeneca vaccine in Canada. Of these, 30 have tested positive for PF4 antibodies, meaning the definition of vaccine-induced immune thrombotic thrombocytopenia, or VITT. Laboratory testing on the remaining 14 individuals is ongoing. Sadly, among these confirmed cases of VIT, there have been 5 deaths reported. We offer our most sincere condolences to the loved ones of those who have passed away. Every week, we get closer to 75% of eligible Canadians having received their first dose of vaccine protection against COVID-19. As we pass that goal in the coming weeks, provinces and territories are also accelerating their second dose programs to get more people in Canada fully vaccinated for optimal protection against COVID-19. If you don't have your first shot or haven't booked an appointment yet, now is the time. This includes those who are pregnant or breastfeeding, as well as those with an autoimmune condition or who are immunosuppressed. If you've already received your first dose, thank you. It's win-win. You are now better protected, and you've taken an important step to bring us closer to ending the crisis phase of the pandemic in Canada. You can now keep an eye out for when you will become eligible to receive your second shot. Even if you already have an appointment, be sure to monitor local public health information, as appointment dates may be moved up as supply increases. Getting that second dose is important, both for your own protection and for building immunity in your community. This is a double win-win. While your first dose provides priming immunity, providing most of us with good protection and reducing the likelihood of severe illness, the second dose is crucial for boosting our immune systems to build strong and longer-lasting immunity. We are on the right path to get back to the things that we miss. Let's keep going steady as we go, and not let complacency hold us back from a safer summer. Thank you.
Brigadier General.
I am pleased to say that as of this week, sufficient doses of Moderna have been delivered to the territories to fully vaccinate 85% of their 18 and older populations and transient workers. In the next week, the territories will receive Pfizer-BioNTech for all their 12 and up youth populations. This is a significant milestone. In total, we have shipped more than 29 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines across Canada. Earlier this week, Canada received its largest single shipment of Pfizer-BioNTech. Deliveries of 2.4 million doses were completed yesterday.
As mentioned in our last technical briefing, early June shipments of Moderna will be arriving in Canada in 2 separate batches. On Wednesday, over 400,000 doses of Moderna arrived in Canada. Those shipments are concluding today. A smaller shipment of 100,000 doses should arrive in Canada next Tuesday and will be distributed to the provinces in the following days. This will bring the total number of Moderna doses delivered to 500,000 for the first half of June. The next shipment of 1.5 million doses should arrive in Canada in mid-June.
We are continuing our regular discussions with the provinces and territories. This week, we met with each province and all territories in order to better understand their respective vaccination programs and how best we can support their immunization campaigns as we look forward to the summer and beyond.
We are on track to distribute over 40 million doses by the end of this month. The National Operations Centre continues to work with our provincial, territorial, and Indigenous partners across the country to ensure that all Canadians who want to get vaccinated can do so safely and as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we take questions, I'll just point out that both the Prime Minister and Minister will have to go for votes at a certain point, but just the doctors and Brigadier General will be available. We'll start with questions on the phone. Operator.
Thank you, merci. You may press star 1 if you have a question. Vous pouvez appuyer sur étoile 1 si vous avez une question. La première question de Raymond Fillon, TVA. La parole est à vous.
Merci. Bon vendredi, Monsieur Trudeau.
Thank you. Happy Friday, Mr. Trudeau. Now, the Commons will be adjourning for the year in a few days. Will you be calling an election before the return in September? As you know, Raymond, our priority remains getting through this third wave of the pandemic and supporting Canadians from coast to coast to coast. We know that the economic recovery is starting, but there's still a lot of work to do, and we're focusing on that. As far as the elections are concerned, I know nobody wants an election right now, so we are focusing on helping Canadians with our work in the House of Commons. And, you know, we know that we are in a minority government situation, and there may be an election eventually.
Qu'est-ce qui vous ferait déclencher des élections?
What would lead you to call an election this summer? What might lead you to do that? Answer. Well, Raymond, if you look at the positions of the other parties, notably the Conservative Party, it's clear that they have a very different vision of the economic recovery, the strong green economic recovery that we want. We've been there to support Canadians at every step. We've been investing in women who were very hard hit by this pandemic. We've made a promise to be there for workers, families, small businesses, young people, and seniors. And we've done that. And throughout this pandemic, the Conservatives criticized us. They said that we were investing too much, helping Canadians too much. But what we've seen is that we've been able to weather this pandemic better than many other comparable countries around the world. And we will continue to invest in a greener, stronger, more innovative, and more effective recovery for everyone. There are significant differences between our vision of a strong recovery and the Conservatives' vision. They are still focusing on cuts, budget cuts to fight the deficit. And at a certain point, we won't be able to function as a parliament like that. But for the moment, our priority remains working for Canadians.
Merci. Prochaine question. Operator.
The next question is from Dylan Robertson from the Winnipeg Free Press. Please go ahead.
Hello, Prime Minister. We've had Indigenous leaders saying it's not appropriate to have bands apply for federal funding to examine residential school burial sites without having a coordinated strategy to ensure the evidence is properly gathered. They say that the funding you've reallocated basically leaves traumatized bands to go through the work of finding their own contractors. You said this week that nobody wants federal agents to come storming reserves, and I don't think anyone's asking for that. The chiefs say they want some sort of coordination. We now have bands in Manitoba appealing to the International Commission on Missing Persons to help guide their work on burial sites. So I'd like to know why your government hasn't committed to an actual strategy for this, and if you're comfortable with global agencies stepping in to fill that gap.
First and foremost, Dylan, as we've said from the beginning, the families and the communities need to be at the center of and in charge of any and all next steps. Obviously, the rigor and the professionalism and the sensitivity and ideally a certain amount of shared processes across the country would make sense. But those are things that the government will not be dictating. Every different community is different. These residential school sites have different significances and different current vocations in communities. Some are community centers, some are museums, some have been torn down. There is a different approach right across the country in regards to these potential burial sites. And I think it's really, really important that we be guided not by what we think must be done in terms of our frameworks, in terms of an approach on international norms, which are all important and should inform the ultimate decisions. But those decisions need to be led by and centered on the families, the survivors, and the communities that are at the heart of this historical and ongoing tragedy.
Follow-up, Dylan?
And Prime Minister, I want to ask you about the Catholic Church withholding residential school records. The Church has not followed its peers in turning over documents. I know your government has asked for records before, but why have you not ramped up that pressure over the past week on the Catholic Church to divulge these records?
Let me just say, Dylan, as a Catholic, I am deeply disappointed by the position that the Catholic Church has taken now and over the past many years. When I went to the Vatican a number of years ago, I directly asked His Holiness Pope Francis to move forward on apologizing, on asking for forgiveness, on restitution, on making these records available, and we're still seeing resistance from the Church, possibly from the Church in Canada. I think it's going to be a really important moment for all of us, particularly Catholics across the country, to reach out in our local parishes, to reach out to bishops and cardinals, and make it clear that we expect the Church to take up and step up and take responsibility for its role in this and be there to help in the grieving and the healing, including with records, that is necessary. It's something a number of other churches, the United Church and others, have done. It's something we are all still waiting for the Catholic Church to do. En tant que catholique,
As a Catholic, I will say that I find it very difficult that the Catholic Church is still refusing to apologize and to participate in this important process of truth and healing. When I went to the Vatican a few years ago, I asked Pope Francis directly to be there, to help people heal, to recognize the role that the Catholic Church played in this tragedy. Unfortunately, over the last years, we have not seen that. And that includes the Catholic authorities here in Canada. The government will continue to put pressure on the Church and other institutions to recognize their role in this. And I would ask Catholics across the country to speak to their priests and bishops and to transmit the message that it is time for the Catholic Church to recognize its responsibility and its share of the guilt, and also to call on the Church to be there during this process of truth and healing that will be so essential.
Just une seconde.
Just a moment, please.
Non, on a une demi-heure avant le vote.
Okay, we still have half an hour before the vote. That's good. Next question.
Operator, next question.
Oh, I'm sorry, thank you. The next question is from Jimmy Pashagumskum from APTN. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm on the phone. Is the Prime Minister still with us?
Yes, I am, very much. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Prime Minister. Now, the Canadian government is currently excluding thousands of First Nations families from settlement talks and class action that deals with the underfunding of the child welfare system and Jordan's principle. This is because because the Crown believes it can, beat them in court based on legal technicalities. And you said time and time again that nothing is more important to Canada than its relationship with Indigenous people. As a gesture of reconciliation, and I know we've heard that term thrown around a lot this past week, will you reverse this position and include these plaintiffs in the settlement talks?
Thank you very much for your question. Let me first be very clear. We are not fighting Indigenous kids in court, regardless of what political opponents may say. We have been working clearly and collaboratively with Indigenous organizations and leadership across the country on the harm that has been done over the past many years to far too many Indigenous kids, now adults, in the Child and Family Services system. We have recognized from the very beginning that those those Indigenous peoples are worthy of compensation, and we will be compensating them. The questions and discussions ongoing with the communities and the leadership is about what the right level of compensation for different groups and different communities are, and those conversations are ongoing. But more than just compensations for wrongs of the past years, we also need to make sure we're moving forward on changing the system that led to Indigenous kids over the past few years continuing to be taken from their communities, taken from their languages, from their cultures. That is unacceptable. And that's why over the past years, we worked with Indigenous communities, Indigenous leadership on reforming child and family services so that Indigenous communities could take care of their kids who are at risk, to put Indigenous language, Indigenous culture, and Indigenous teachings at the center of child and family services. That was what Bill C-92 did, which was passed last year in partnership with Indigenous communities, and something that we are continuing to work on now to not just compensate for the past, but to make a change for now and the future to make sure that kids are supported by community, by language, by culture, even in difficult moments. D'abord, je veux souligner que malgré ce que disent
First of all, I want to say that despite what some politicians have said, we are not fighting Indigenous children in court. We are working with different organizations, different communities, to ensure that there is fair compensation for young people, those who perhaps are not so young anymore, who suffered damages, who suffered harm, physical and mental harm in the child protection services system. We recognize that these individuals deserve compensation, and we will compensate them. The question is, what is the appropriate level of compensation for a given individual, given their circumstances? And that is something that we are working on constructively. But we have to remember that it's not just enough to compensate people for things that happened a few years ago, 10 years ago. We also need to end the child protection services system that continues to take children from their communities. It takes them away from their language, their culture, their traditional learning, and it leaves them in a very difficult situation in terms of their cultural identity. That's why, for the last number of years, we've been working with Indigenous communities to reform the Child Protection Act. And because we were able to get that bill through last year, we are now able to change the system in depth to better protect children now and in the coming years. This is concrete progress. There is still work to do, but we will continue that work.
A follow-up, Jimmy?
Yes. Respectfully, Mr. Prime Minister, there's some who might disagree with you. In last September, actually, you said that you would not fight certification. And then you kind of went back on it and said that you want to exclude victims between 1991 and 2007. So these are families who are now adult children. They suffered or some have died while waiting for Canadian government, to provide services that they're legally obligated to. So, especially with the recent discovery, in Kamloops of 215 children in the grades, and to this day, kids are still in danger in care. Some may say that this is an ongoing genocide. As an act of quote-unquote reconciliation, can you commit to the Justice Department to include these people in the class action settlement talks?
First of all, you bring up exactly the right point, James, that the ongoing removal of kids from their communities to live with foster families, to go to other cities or towns where they lose their culture, they lose their language, they lose their identity, needs to stop. That's why we have moved forward to co-develop legislation with Indigenous peoples called C-92 to make sure that child and family services systems across the country, and this of course involves significantly provincial areas of jurisdiction, but to get kids, Indigenous kids, out of the provincial system and into a system that is centered in their own culture, their own language, their own communities. This is at the heart of the colonial legacy that Canada has built, whether it was residential schools or whether it is the current articulation of that with kids removed from communities, quote unquote, for their own good because they're at risk. That's unacceptable. And that is something that since the beginning in 2015, we started working on. And we got to a place where we passed groundbreaking legislation to put control over kids at risk back into Indigenous communities, to keep them safe, but also to keep them centered in their language and their cultures. That is the path that we have taken, and there is much more work to do, but we have made significant changes to make sure that going forward, we don't see the kind of trauma, the kind of loss, the kind of abuse that unfortunately has been all too common in the past, and not the distant past, even the recent past of years and decades.
Prime Minister, the federal government has in its possession, in its various archives, documents that were generated both by the federal government and the churches. And these are documents that Indigenous-led groups that are trying to help people and communities like Kamloops get to the bottom of the unmarked burials. They say those documents are key. You say it's up to Catholics to pressure the church to release those documents. Your government has the documents and copies of many of them. Why not rescind any agreements that give the churches or the Oblats or any other group a say in their release? Why not compel disclosure?
I think if it is necessary, we will take stronger measures. But I think the pressure that we've seen by many Catholics like myself over the course of the past many days, wondering why the Catholic Church in Canada is silent, is not stepping up, is not showing the leadership that, quite frankly, is supposed to be at the core of our faith, of forgiveness, of responsibility, of acknowledging truth. These are things that I am very hopeful that the Catholic Church will very soon change its approach on. And if it doesn't, as you say, Tonda, we have tools that we can use because truth is at the heart of understanding our past and preventing further damage to the future. That's why it was called the Truth and Reconciliation commission, and we need to have truth before we can talk about justice, healing, and reconciliation. Je pense que
I think that having conversations and putting pressure on the church, as many Catholics are doing, is good. You know, we can pressure them to admit that at the heart of faith is the idea of forgiveness. I think and I hope that we will see a much more open and accountable approach on the part of the Catholic Church in the coming days. But we do have tools that we can use if necessary, although I think it would be better for everyone if we were able to do this in partnership and in the spirit of agreement.
Mr. Kevin Gallagher, CTV National News. I just want to follow up on Tanda's question. So, you say that the government has the tools to compel these documents, and you say if it's necessary, you will. Well, how come now is not necessary? What are you waiting for?
Obviously, and I'm not going to get into the details of what tools and what processes and what documents. Let me talk about the basic principles. We have committed as a country to revealing the truth, to sharing the truth, to allowing access to the truth, first and foremost, so communities can understand what happened to their loved ones and grieve them and mourn them and perhaps bring them home. These are the things that are most important for Canadians and for Canada right now. And our role in ensuring that that happens is one that we take very seriously, and we will be there to ensure that the truth is known. Now, before we have to start taking the Catholic Church to court, I am very hopeful that religious leaders will understand that this is something they need to participate in and not hide from, that forgiveness and redemption is a path we all are told we should be walking on through our faith, and I am confident that the Catholic Church is hearing these calls very clearly and is understanding the kind of dismay and grief that many Canadians are feeling right now at seeing the continued lack of action.
David Aiken, Global News. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. So you did a little stock taking in your opening remarks about the TRC calls to action, drinking water advisories. I'd like to do a little stock taking for this week. On Monday, you said you would directly speak to Ministers Bennett, Lametti, Vandal, Miller, and you promised concrete action. 2 days later, Minister Bennett sort of opened the wicket up and said, come apply for money. So is that it for the concrete action? Is there more concrete action that will be coming on the residential schools, et cetera?
Yes, there is much more action to come. There is much more work to be done. As I referred to on Monday, we talked about the fact that we set aside over $30 million for exactly this. Had been working with communities around ways to flow that money, but that has been accelerated significantly this week, and families and communities can move forward. And let me be very, very clear that we will be there with whatever supports are necessary for communities and Indigenous leadership to move forward in the way that is appropriate for their community. It's not up to the federal government to dictate this, that, or the other thing. It's not up to international bodies to choose to come in, although they would be welcome. It is about Indigenous communities having the tools that they need to move forward. It's not up to the federal government to decide what those tools are either. But we will be there and are now engaged in direct conversations with communities that are stunned and shocked and grieving and hurting because of the recent news. and want to move forward in a way that is supporting their families, their elders, their community in the right way. And we as a government will be there concretely with action and resources as they need to for moving forward.
CBC, I'd like to ask you about the past and the present day. You're going to be speaking to Ryerson students this afternoon, and I'm wondering if the events of the past week have made you reconsider the idea of honoring people like Egerton Ryerson, like Sir John A. Macdonald, who this building is named after, whether you think that's still appropriate. And on the present day, after the release of your National Action Plan yesterday, Marion Buller, the commissioner of the MMIWG report, came out and said she was disappointed, and she doesn't see why an Indigenous person would trust the government on this issue. So all your words about reconciliation, why do you think it is that so many Indigenous people, or some Indigenous people, don't trust your government or you?
First of all, on the Sir John A. Macdonald building that we're in right now, on Ryerson University, where I will be speaking later today, there are lots of really important conversations to have, and I think we need to have them as Canadians who grapple with a past that is not just a historical past, but a past that has impacts on the present right now. I think there are serious and mature conversations we need to have, and I can't dictate whether it's appropriate for this place or that place to carry this name or that name. But I think being eyes wide open about what we choose to honor and commemorate, I think we always need to know, we always need to retain awareness of the past, but awareness that is nuanced and informed and understanding. And the decisions on who we commemorate and how we commemorate them are decisions that we have to take through careful reflection and open and difficult conversations in our communities and in our society. In regards to why there are Indigenous leaders and communities and individuals who continue to mistrust government, I think it's obvious why. The level to which the institutions, Parliament, Prime Ministers have let down Indigenous peoples over the past decades, generations, and centuries is well documented. That's why there's nothing I can say that's suddenly going to make everything all right. That's why the work of reconciliation is hard. And it involves more than just a government. It involves Canadians. It involves organizations and orders of government. It involves individual choices and collective choices. And most of all, it involves action. Action that's going to rebuild trust step by step. And for every boil water advisory we end, for every school we open, for every of the hundreds of thousands of Jordan's principal requests we grant, there's still more to do. And there's still people who continue to be suffering the legacy of colonialism that Canada has laid forward. I don't begrudge anyone their grief, their skepticism, their impatience, because I feel that impatience too. But the hurts and the wrongs, the intergenerational trauma, the layers of barriers and harms that continue to this day, not as part of our past, but as part of our present, require an awful lot of work by all of us. And this government has been and continues to be very serious about moving forward, and moving forward in a way that is in partnership and informed by the work that we're doing together and by Indigenous leadership itself. And as we move forward on the pathways that we announced yesterday in the National Action Plan to end the ongoing tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, as we look at strengthening community security, as we move to reforming the justice system, as we look to healing and mental health supports, as we look to education, and all the different things that we can and must be doing together, there will be some people who continue to sit back and say it's not enough, and that is their right. But there are others who are taking chances and stepping forward and participating and helping us make sure that we get things right. I'm not going to begrudge anyone the choices they make. But I am going to thank those people who, despite all the hurt, despite all the trauma, despite all the mistrust, continue to believe that working together, that moving forward on these solutions is the only path, not just for reconciliation, but for Canada.
And Minister and Prime Minister will now have to excuse themselves to go vote.
Nope, I still got time. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Mr. Trudeau. Man Hamidi with the Canadian Press. The United Nations Human Rights Office has called this morning on Canada to conduct investigations into the burial site in Kamloops and in other locations across the country. Former Senators Mary Sinclair and the former chair of the TRC Commission, he said yesterday that Canada also there should be an investigation, but he said the federal government shouldn't run that investigation. How are you going to grant some accountability and make sure that those who committed these human rights violations in residential schools that led to the deaths of hundreds of Indigenous children are brought to account?
As I've said, we will put the families and the communities at the center of our path forward. What the government of Canada thinks is the right thing to do or wants to do is secondary in this issue. As I've said, we will be there to support what the communities want and need. We are open to international participation. We are open to common standards across the country. We are open to individual approaches for every single one of these communities. We are open and there to be a partner with resources and support for every community in its path for grieving, for healing, and for reconciliation.
Laurence Martin, Radio-Canada. Est-ce que c'est pas un peu facile, Monsieur Trudeau, de critiquer...
Mr. Trudeau, is it not perhaps a little too easy to criticize the Catholic Church when Indigenous people across the country now are reproaching your government's actions? Answer. I think we all have our share of responsibility here when it comes to the calls to action from the TRC. We have worked on 80% of what was under our control. We managed to implement a lot of the calls to action, but some of them are longer-term projects. One of those calls to action was for the Catholic Church, the Vatican, to apologize. Well, it's not up to the federal government to do that. We did our part by asking the Pope to apologize, but we all have work to do. And we can't just say, oh, it's not my responsibility, the Church has to do it themselves. That's not what I said. We all have work to do. And we have done work as a government. Whether it's the new legislation to protect Indigenous languages, putting Indigenous communities in charge of their at-risk children, whether it's lifting more than 100 boil water advisories, or building hundreds of new schools for Indigenous children across the country. We are here to work with Indigenous communities. We recognize that there's much more to do, but we are not the only ones who have to do this. There are organizations like churches and other stakeholders who have a role to play as well. And Canadians have a role to play too. In our daily lives, we all have opportunities to learn more about Canada's history and to see the ramifications of that history in our life today. Each and every one of us can learn about this and take responsibility so that we can finally put this colonial tragedy behind us.
So I believe the Prime Minister and the Minister have to vote now. The Minister will return after she votes, but we'll go back to the phone as soon as the Prime Minister leaves for questions.
That is
for
the Prime Minister of Canada. Had been told it was time to go, but decided that he was going to stay a little bit longer, but is going off to vote inside the House of Commons, giving us his regular COVID update briefing, but also being asked a lot of questions today about reconciliation, given the week that has unfolded in this country. I'll bring in David Cochrane and Janice McGregor for their thoughts. Why don't we start on the reconciliation piece? Lots of questions asked, but I know both of us, just from all three of us from our emailing, probably the most striking comments were his comments to Catholics in this country and about the Catholic Church. David, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, that stood out to me as a guy who's a product of the Newfoundland and Labrador Catholic education system and the own particularly painful history in my home province with the Catholic Church. It resonates to a significant degree. I was with the Prime Minister on that trip to the Vatican 4 years ago when he made the direct appeal to Pope Francis to make the apology for what happened in the residential school system and the Catholic Church's role. And I think the best they've gotten so far from the Catholic Church was an expression of sorrow. Clearly, that is not satisfactory to the survivors and the family members of this particular system. And the obstruction on the release of documents, for example, the unwillingness to go along with it, it led to a scolding of the Catholic Church by the Prime Minister there, and also what seemed to me, quite frankly, Rosie, to be a bit of a legal threat, that they may in fact take the Catholic Church to court to compel the disclosure of these documents. Now, whether they can do that through through court methods or through an act of the legislature, I don't know. The Prime Minister would not disclose what the particular strategy was, instead making a public appeal, not just to church leaders, but to church members to put pressure at the very basic level of your local diocese for people to compel the church to cooperate with this national project on truth and reconciliation that is laid out before us. So I thought that was pretty strong from the Prime Minister and fairly bold for him to lecture the church in such a fashion. But, having sat in a lot of courtrooms covering historical sexual abuse cases back when I was a reporter in Newfoundland from either Mount Cashel or the broader church scandals, you can understand some of that frustration. And I think, quite frankly, it mirrors some of the frustration that Indigenous and First Nation Canadians feel about the slow pace and the reluctance of the federal government on legal issues to cooperate more fully in the name of healing. But certainly that was the most significant thing I think we heard from the Prime Minister today.
And to remind Canadians that while other churches who ran residential schools in this country have apologized, the Catholic Church, which ran probably about 60% of residential schools, has not formally apologized. And it was interesting too, Janice, that the Prime Minister reflected on his own faith as a Catholic and how that sort of made him feel in relation to this.
Yeah, there was no separation between church and state at all in those answers. This was personal. This was direct. This was from one Catholic to another, questioning the wisdom of the leadership of the church. I like David, found it extremely bold. I agree. It sounded to me like a threat too, to take them to court. A very extraordinary thing for someone who has lived a very public life as a Catholic, married Catholic, raised by his father to be Catholic. So, this is an interesting turn. I think it's an escalation in the rhetoric. We'll see if it's an escalation in the action, but he's absolutely right to point to this as kind of a barrier, and it was unfinished business during the TRC. That church, unfortunately, was not the partner that other churches were in the whole kind of post-settlement agreement process. And if we're getting personal, I'm a member of one of the churches that was the Presbyterian Church. I know what my own faith has tried to do to contribute in its way. to take responsibility. This is an open debate among people of Christian faiths in this country. What is appropriate? How much is enough? And the Prime Minister getting right into it today.
Yeah, and he also, even before he took questions, also tried to lay out, perhaps in a clearer way, coming to the end of this week, the things the government has done in order to make progress on reconciliation. Whether he talks about, water advisories, whether he talks about the fact that Jordan Principal's requests had been previously ignored and now they started to grant them. But he also said, and I also found this response compelling, he said, "There's nothing I can say that's going to make everything all right, and I don't begrudge anyone their grief, their skepticism, and their impatience." Okay, let's just do a quick go round on COVID because there's still a pandemic, even though we're dealing with all these other issues this week. And there was lots of positive news on that front too, David, in terms of how things are going to continue to roll in and how quickly this country might end up with, a large part of the population double dosed.
Yeah, you've got clarity and certainty now on Pfizer in that we now have the delivery schedule from what has become the workhorse vaccine of the country's vaccination effort right up until the end of August, with an option for 3 million more doses to be purchased at some point in September, meaning a total of 51 million Pfizer doses alone, before the official end of summer, which is around September 21st to September 22nd. So you have that clarity. So that's more than 2 million doses each and every week between now and the end of August, and that will really help accelerate the vaccine effort. And you're seeing the miracle of the vaccines really kind of playing out in real time, Rosie. Yeah. There is a lot of lockdown measures and public health restrictions still in place, but if you listen to the update Dr. Tam gave, daily cases down the country are down 78% from the peak of the third wave. Wow. And you're seeing just the low level of nobody's over 1,000 cases now in a province on a daily basis, Ontario being the last to sort of get under that marker, and provinces are starting to reopen. So you're seeing 1 in every 3 doses right now being a second dose being given. Canada like to brag about its first dose metric and the speed at which that was happening, but the real true test of vaccinating your population is that second dose coverage. And while we lag behind most countries, at the top of the list in that category, look for that gap to close based on these consistent, reliable Pfizer deliveries. And if Moderna can get sorted out, which I hear is close but still kind of fraught, and other things like that can happen, then you can really give it that big push and acceleration. But when we started talking about Pfizer aggressively in February, Rosie, was when they shut down their plant in Belgium. We didn't get any doses for a week or two. It's a very different story right now, and the country's in much better position, largely because of the efforts of one drug company.
Yeah, the Brigadier General Brody saying last week, or earlier this week rather, we received our largest single shipment of Pfizer, 2.4 million, and those doses were handed out to provinces yesterday. Last word to you, Janice.
Can I plug a bit of my own journalism on vaccines, Rosie, if you don't mind? So this is something I think people should watch. So this week, the federal government opened its vaccine injury support program. This is a no-fault compensation scheme. Canada's been the only country that did not have a system where if you had a often rare but serious effect from taking one of these vaccines that were rolling out in the millions, you could be compensated for having done the right thing. The government would have your back. This is now underway, but there are a lot of questions about it, how broad this coverage is going to be. That was the focus of my journalism today, talking to some people who are among there's been 15 or 16 cases of a rare disorder called Guillain-Barré syndrome, very frightening response of their immune systems to their vaccines through no fault of their own. The government, as this vaccination campaign continues, has these bits of unfinished business on the side amid the good news of cases dropping and people being able to get back to normal. There are also these other legitimate concerns we don't always talk a lot about, and the efforts the government is making to try to address their concerns for the sake of confidence in the system and getting more transparency about all the science. So commend that to your reading, if you will.
Yes, and I should have plugged your journalism, Janice. Apologies. You can check that out at cbc.ca/politics. It's an important story. Thank you, Janice McGregor. I know you're going to continue through the day. I appreciate it very much. David Cochran, thank you. You also posted a story while we were on air that people can go check out, but you are also guest hosting Power and Politics later today, so people can find you there. Thank you both very much. Appreciate it. We are going to send you back now to the ongoing press conference with cabinet ministers and public health officials and our very own Hannah T. Thibodeau will pick up that coverage after this. You're watching CBC News Network.
Of the pandemic, when we have to repeatedly escalate our public health response as a result of massive surges in virus activity. So I think the parameters or the indicators that we're watching are, I think, quite familiar to everyone. One is, of course, the activity of the virus and the number of cases, the rates, the trajectory of them, whether they're increasing or decreasing, escalating, the steepness of the increase, the size of the curve, but also the impact on hospitalizations, ICU admissions, and of course, deaths is a more longer term indicator. So I do think that this is still a time of caution. We are monitoring vaccination rates as well as one indicator. We've suggested that through modeling, if we have 75% of the population getting their first dose and 20% getting second dose, you can begin to lift those measures without overwhelming your health system. And of course, getting 2 doses into everyone means that we're having a safer fall. And what do I mean by that is that I'm looking to a fall where we don't have to keep going back to those very restrictive public health measures, and that our health system can cope. So that we get back into the fall and winter time, not having these crises going on all the time. But there will be continuing, I think, outbreaks upon which we have to act very quickly to respond to. And those outbreaks, I believe, will tend to occur in under-vaccinated pockets of the community. And of course, if there are more variants that are transmissible, that is, or more severe, cause more severe illness that will impact us. But certainly vaccines are playing a major role if we look at countries that have been a little bit ahead of us, and that we can look towards getting back to some of the activities that we are looking forward to. So those are some of the key indicators. We did publish some indicators for how to ease opening up of our social economic spaces. But equally speaking, if those indicators go another direction, we have to, again, act very quickly. But the bottom line is 2 doses of vaccine is going to get us quite far ahead. I have to say that 75% 2 doses is a goal based on the level of vaccination, so that we don't overwhelm our health system. But we can do better than that. I actually think we should keep going. This isn't a threshold or a limit. We've seen some communities getting over 80%, some seniors getting over 90% vaccine coverage, and so we should shoot for the stars, basically.
And we'll go back to the phone for one final question. Operator?
Thank you, merci. The next question is from Dylan Robertson from the Winnipeg Free Press. Please go ahead.
Hi there. A question for Brigadier General Krista Brody. I'm wondering about expired doses. Provinces keep turning their backs on AstraZeneca, so I'm wondering what the plan is to avoid doses from expiring, and if we're going to send these to COVAX, and how many have actually expired so far.
So we're working very closely with the provinces to ensure that we use as many doses as possible to support their immunization campaigns. For AstraZeneca, the 2 lots that were due to expire on the 31st of May have been extended. They've been extended to the 1st of July. So those doses are still in the jurisdictions and can be used to support the provinces as they roll out their second dose strategy for those who received AstraZeneca as their first doses. We continue to monitor very closely what the requirements are and to match our supply with the demand that's being signaled by the provinces, so that we don't waste doses, or so that we minimize the wastage as much as possible.
And a follow-up, Dylan?
Thanks. My follow-up is about the CBC reporting that Brigadier General Simon Bernard has been taken off the vaccine task force, the rollout for an alleged racist comment. They're alleging that he used the N-word at work. I just wanted to ask Brigadier General Krista Brody what it says that we have another soldier taken off the vaccine task force, and also Dr. Tam, what you make of this as you've talked about racism.
So I'm not in a position to speak to the alleged allegations pertaining to Brigadier General Simard. What I can indicate is that we are very focused on the team here at the Public Health Agency to ensure that we distribute vaccines as quickly, as safely, as efficiently as we can in a manner that's fair and equitable to all. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question, and thank you, Brigadier General Brody. Thanks to the support from the Canadian Armed Forces, we're confident that work will just continue and vaccines will be delivered, and the work with the provinces continue. So we're not concerned about that capacity. At the same time, of course, I know actually nothing about the specific incident, but we have to promote safe workplaces, respectful workplaces. There is no place, of course, for racism and stigma and discrimination in a workplace or in our society. It shouldn't be tolerated. So, I think throughout this pandemic, we've seen people coming together to collaborate. And I think that, of course, we need to continue to focus on our strengths and embrace the diversity in our population. And racism is in many different systems, whether it's the health system or other systems of society. And we, of course, all need to do better. Thank you.
Thank you. And that concludes today's press conference.
Good afternoon. I'm Hannah Thibodeau. This is CBC News Network. Of course, that was Canada's top public health officials giving the latest on the pandemic in this country. One of the things we heard there from Dr. Theresa Tam is that we are, as Canadians, getting close to that threshold of 75% of Canadians over the age of 12 getting that first dose and 20% fully vaccinated, which translates into the fact that Canada could start easing and opening some restrictions. Let's bring in the CBC's Evan Dyer, who's been watching that briefing the whole time. Evan, what did you take from that press conference, and how close are we to easing those restrictions as per Dr. Tam?
Well, it sounds like the end game now is very much in sight and actually pretty clearly laid out, because we certainly have the delivery schedule for the most important of all the vaccines, Pfizer, BioNTech, which has really led the vaccination campaign in Canada. God knows really where Canada would be without Pfizer, BioNTech. And today we saw ministers and public health officials thanking Pfizer, BioNTech for having honored all of its contractual commitments to Canada and keeping those doses flowing. By the end of August, they will have delivered 51 million doses to Canada. So that is just by itself enough to get you to that goal of 75% with the first dose and 20% with the second dose. And of course, that's without counting the other vaccines that have been approved for use in Canada, at least 2 of which are also still entering the country. And it's also without counting vaccines that we might receive from the United States. So clearly the end is in sight. If the goal is to vaccinate people, if the goal is to get to 75% first dose, well, we're already at 2/3. So that leaves only about 10% more to get. And what we're seeing now is that more of the doses being administered every day are second doses. So after a week where we saw about 2.8 million vaccines distributed, we're also seeing that about 1 in 4 now are going to be second doses. So we can expect that number to come up pretty quickly. That's important, because one of the areas of COVID research that we've seen moving ahead is most rapidly is the research into the interactions between variants and vaccine. How will vaccinated people, fully and partially vaccinated people, respond when exposed to these variants, such as the Indian variant? And this is very preliminary research. It may change, but there are indications that, for example, a person with 1 dose of AstraZeneca may have a fairly low level of immunity against, for example, the Indian variant of COVID, or what I should say is the variant first detected in India of COVID-19. And that could be as low as about 30% immunity. So it's very important to get those second doses out there. And what we've really learned is that what's going to depend, I should say, really decide how far Canada gets in trying to reach herd immunity is going to be resistance and vaccine hesitancy. It isn't going to be the supply. The supply is going to be there, but it's going to now depend on convincing people to take them. Indications are, looking at the first dose numbers, that Canada, which is pulled ahead of some of the best performers in the US and UK, will probably do very well on second doses too. There are people who take the first dose and then fail the shot for the second dose. But indications are that resistance and hesitancy to vaccines is lower in Canada, certainly than in the US, possibly also lower than in the UK. And that bodes well. And we heard Theresa Tam there talking about shoot for the stars, populations, smaller populations that have achieved vaccination rates in excess of 80 and even 90%. So if Canada could get everybody over age 12 vaccinated to a rate of 90%, most experts would say that is a pretty strong range for herd immunity against any variant of COVID-19.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions just at the end there, Evan, that was asked of Brigadier General Krista Brody was the fact what type of spoilage we're seeing for vaccines. And I think in particular they were talking about AstraZeneca there. What did you have to say about that?
Yeah. Right. Well, we didn't get a very detailed answer there, but we do know that because of resistance to the use of AstraZeneca, which is much stronger than to other vaccines, there are problems getting these vaccines used before they expire. Those problems have affected the United States more than any other country, of course, but they may also be affecting Canada. And now we see that the U.S. is going to partly solve its problem of AstraZeneca spoilage by giving yet more AstraZeneca potentially to Canada, which would increase the supply at a time that a generally preferred vaccine, Pfizer, is rolling into the country at a rate of 2.4 million doses a week. So it's very clear that AstraZeneca, of all the vaccines, is going to be the one that if we end up with surpluses, if we end up with spoilage, it's going to be with AstraZeneca. And I think this is why we see more talk now of giving AstraZeneca back or giving AstraZeneca surplus doses to the COVAX facility, to Gavi, to share with countries that don't have any vaccines or have hardly any vaccines for their populations, developing countries around the world, because it's very clear that most developed countries are going to end up with more of this stuff than they need.
Okay, thanks, Evan. Appreciate your